somebody's having an NDE and they meet another soul in the other realm who they didn't know had died. And then they come back to life only to be told that that person actually died while they were having an NDE. There's an ancient Chinese example of that. And this kind of local provincial ruler is on his deathbed and he's dying of an illness. He leaves his body and he goes to the other world and meets the Emperor of Heaven. And standing next to the Emperor of Heaven, he sees this little boy. And then he's sent back to life. And then years later, he's walking down a street in like some other town and he sees a man blocking his path as he's walking down the street. And the guy's like making eye contact, like he knows him. And he says, "Who are you? Do I know you from somewhere?" And the guy proceeds to like recount this man's near-death experience in great detail. The guy who had the NDE said, "That's amazing. How did you know that?" And he says, "I was the little boy standing next to the emperor. I had died. I had a near-death experience and I came back to life."
If you could just begin by giving a little background to yourself. I know you've probably done this a bunch of times, but how you came to be kind of studying NDEs, and you can kind of give me the abbreviated version.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't really plan on it. I was actually doing archaeology. I'd done what they call a diploma in the UK, which is I guess equivalent to an AA in America, in Eastern Mediterranean archaeology. Then I went and did my degree in Egyptian archaeology. So I was kind of focused in that world with no intention of studying NDEs. I knew about them, I'd read about them since I was a teenager and was always kind of fascinated by the idea. But what kind of sparked the interest was I was reading the ancient Egyptian text, because you have to do hieroglyphs on this course. And so we're reading about the Book of the Dead and the pyramid texts and the coffin texts especially. These are texts that describe the journey to the afterlife realm of the soul after death. And as I was reading them, I just thought, this actually sounds really familiar. If you kind of strip away some of these cultural elements in a kind of thematic way, it sounds a lot like a near-death experience. Because the soul leaves the body, travels through darkness, goes to another world, meets a being of light in the form of the sun god, meets deceased relatives, has transformations, all these kind of similar NDE-like things. So I just started thinking, I wonder if a case could be made for ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs being kind of grounded in somebody having had an NDE or knowledge of NDEs, and then kind of elaborating upon that in a sort of cultural way. So I tested that by looking at different ancient civilizations around the world and comparing them with this kind of what we know about NDEs.
And would you describe yourself, or were you religious before? Did you have any belief in an afterlife? Or were you, I know some people come from a kind of an atheistic, scientific point of view, and then they change their mind later, but how were you before you kind of started on this venture?
Yeah, I wasn't raised religious. I kind of had exposure to a lot of different religions growing up. My mom was kind of the hippie era, and she was also like a kind of hippie intellectual type, so she was like really into Carl Jung and Ram Dass and these kind of, she did her thesis on William Blake and the psychedelic experience. So that gives some idea of the environment I grew up in. So she'd take me to the Hare Krishna temple, to a Buddhist temple. And then I had like a traditional New Mexico Spanish Catholic grandmother. And so we'd go to like Catholic things with her. And then on my dad's side, they were Jewish. So we'd go to like bar mitzvah or Jewish wedding or whatever.
Oh, wow.
So I was kind of like raised to be like, a historian of religions, basically.
That's really cool, actually.
Yeah. But in my mind, none of it was real. It was almost like, going to Disneyland and pretending it was real or something. It was all just kind of this like theoretical thing and almost like, wow, it's so interesting what people actually believe. And so the whole concept of belief was not even like part of my way of being in the world. And it kind of still isn't. I kind of feel like I either know things or I don't know things. And I don't really like believe in things that I don't think have evidence or that I'm not sure of. So I kind of try to, maintain that objectivity.
When you started to look at these civilizations, and I know you branched out to, I think, 5 different ones, and then why did you choose, I guess, those in that area? Or did you think it was a good sample size or a good enough time and space between these where you could assume that they weren't contacting each other? Like, how did you kind of parse all that out?
Yeah, it was exactly that. Essentially that, there was some contact between, say, ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt, but it wasn't like they were sharing the same gods and religion and mythologies and all that. They essentially emerged independently of each other and then later had kind of trade and interactions. And it was the same with the others I chose, which were India before what we call Hinduism, the kind of Vedic period, they call it. China before Buddhism, and in Mesoamerica, Aztec and Mayan sorts of cultures. So there was basically no possibility that like the afterlife belief that I described for ancient Egypt could have traveled from one civilization to the next all around the world. So it can't be explained by what they call diffusion of myth. So I thought if that's ruled out, then we need some other way of explaining the cross-cultural similarities to near-death experiences. And so either that's that they're having near-death experiences, or some kind of Jungian thing like, archetypes, that the human brain is, we have a collective consciousness that's kind of drawing these symbols from some well, or a cognitive psychology thing where our brains just happen to work in this particular way that constructs afterlife beliefs in the same ways. So, but in any case, some kind of, universalist type of explanation that doesn't rely on diffusion of myths.
Have you, and I don't want to, I guess this might jump us kind of out of order in terms of, well, I guess we should start maybe by describing the encounters that people have while having an NDE. I think you mentioned there might be 9, but I know everybody's kind of different in terms of what signposts they use as, oh, this is an NDE. And then some people say, well, this doesn't appear in these ones. But do you have, I know you have like a set kind of criteria that you were looking at in terms of what was appearing in these texts to kind of show you, or at least give you hints that, hey, this could be that.
Although actually, I did it exactly the reverse.
Okay.
I thought, I didn't want to go in and like impose NDE features like the Grayson scale that they use in near-death studies, where, or even Raymond Moody did this. Here's this, 15 or 17 elements, and if it has a certain number, we can call it an NDE. I kind of flipped that on its head, and I thought, let's look at what the afterlife beliefs actually say, and then kind of see if those correspond to near-death experience phenomenology, as they call it in
smart
research. Yeah, which is basically just the descriptive elements of the experience, what people are actually saying their experience consisted of, these particular elements. So so by doing that, it's almost like that's how these 9 elements emerged as the common features between these ancient civilizations, and they just happened to correspond with near-death experiences. So essentially they were, leaving the body, entering darkness, emerging into light, meeting a being of light, meeting deceased relatives. And after leaving the body, a corpse encounter, which I interpreted that as a kind of symbol of out-of-body experiences. So the person who's dying and leaving the body, they will have some kind of encounter either with their own corpse or like the corpses of gods, which kind of symbolize the spiritual transformation of the soul in the other world.
Mm-hmm.
And then some kind of evaluation of their earthly life, whether that's judgment or just some kind of life review type of feature. And what was the last one? And then kind of reaching a barrier or a border that they can't cross over. At that point, they have to kind of go through these different gates in the other world. And then there's also, these other realms on the other side of those gates. What's missing, of course, is, because these are texts about, they're essentially like guidebooks to the afterlife to help the soul transition. So what's missing is the return part, because, these are souls who are already dead. There's no expectation that they're going to come back.
And how do you, when I was looking over your stuff, I was kind of like, the one question, I'm sure you've heard of a lot too, and something you had to be aware of, was how do you parse out what was like allegory, storytelling through time? Like, is this an NDE, or can I map this to the NDE framework, or is it just someone kind of telling the story to prove, you know what I mean? Like, because like so many things, I'm sure, across language and time and culture, it's like these things must vary widely. So how do you, I guess, transfer that into like the NDE framework, and how can you be sure that it wasn't kind of, I guess, misidentified?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's kind of one of the major things that's I try to kind of unpack in the book on ancient civilizations. Is, so we have all this thematic similarity, but then we have, in China, souls of the dead ascend on the backs of dragons. In the Vedas, they ascend on a green swan. In India, it's on the smoke of their own cremation. In Egypt, it's, joining the sun god in the circuit in the other world. So it's all these very specific manifestations of what are nevertheless descriptions of the soul ascending to another world.
Uh-huh.
And it's the same with, the being of light. It's a sun god named Re in Egypt. It's a sun god named named Utu in Sumer. There's sun and moon gods in India. So there's all these kind of, again, thematic ideas that correspond to NDEs, but they're very clearly culturally expressed. So the way to kind of identify them was really thematically. So what I ended up doing is kind of breaking it down into 3 levels. The thematic, or what I called structural level, which is basically the existence of a story about a soul leaving the body and going to another world.
Uh-huh.
And then there was what I called mythemes, which I got from anthropologist Levi Strauss. And those are essentially those elements that I talked about on the thematic level. So leaving the body, encountering a being of light, traveling through darkness, those kinds of things. And then there's the symbolic level, which is, that the being of light is Utu or Re or Varuna or whatever other god it might be. The method of ascent and all those things. Those are on this sort of, symbolic cultural level. So that's essentially, how I thought it needed to be looked at in, kind of compartmentalized into these 3 different categories of analysis, basically.
Okay. And have you received any pushback or anything to oh, you're not, or you're pulling things out of context, or you're not understanding the context of the time it was written? Or has it been, at least that part of your research, has that been pretty accepted?
Yeah, occasionally people will make that accusation before they've read the work. I've had people say what is a Native American near-death experience, in a kind of condescending way. And, because they don't have a word for near-death experience.
Uh-huh.
So that's why I look at it by the context. So a Native American near-death experience is when somebody dies temporarily, or is perceived to have been dead temporarily, revives and talks about things that happened to them when they were perceived to be dead to their consciousness. So one of the main kind of criticisms in comparative research has been that decontextualizing, taking things out of context. And I'm very careful not to do that. I'm looking specifically at afterlife beliefs. So I'm not looking at a creation myth and saying, oh, this has all the hallmarks of a near-death experience.
Uh-huh.
I'm respecting the context of the myth or the story or the account within each culture.
Okay.
And I think to deny that would be the kind of more ethnocentric thing of saying, well, no, we know better than they do, which a lot of scholars actually have done. So I'm trying to kind of correct that and respect our sources more than some other people do.
There's definitely a whole bias to where if it's older and before us, and they're somehow less intelligent or not accurate, or all they can think about is mystical things and spiritual things and supernatural things, and they can never recount anything factually. So I've noticed that's, I mean, it's even a bias I have. It must be kind of put into you when you're young and you're reading stuff, and you kind of look at old things and you think, oh, that's less sophisticated, therefore they're dumb, or they don't have an accurate telling of their history. Is that pretty? I mean, do you find, is it just, I mean, what is it about old text? Because you've done this for so long. Is it a bias that we're carrying, or are there elements there that kind of justify that viewpoint? Or is it just grounded in we're a different culture and we just look down on, as simple as that, another human being?
I think it's probably a combination of all those things. I mean, just for example, there are things in some of these near-death. So going beyond the descriptions of the afterlife, there are also actual accounts of near-death experiences in most of these civilizations and across culture and small-scale societies and everywhere else. So a lot of those accounts are very clearly elaborated upon, even when it sounds totally like a near-death experience. They will say, and then the person was told in the other world that we would win this battle and we would conquer the enemy, or so they have these very specific kind of political or social goals, which sometimes make them a little suspicious about how accurate they really are. So there are different levels of truth-telling, if we can even put it in those terms, or accurate reporting. But it always strikes me that scholars are willing to accept and believe most of what our sources tell us. I mean, we can't construct a cultural history of any culture without listening to what they tell us, right? So when we hear about, just as an example pulled out of a hat, the history of the Mayan civilization, what we know about them is a lot from records from their hieroglyphs, from what they told Spaniards, from the pyramids, from their remains. So we believe all that and we accept it. We piece together this chronology and we know this particular civilization was attacked by this particular civilization at a particular time, and all these kind of historical events, the succession of kings, the whole hierarchy of society, their religious rituals, their religious beliefs. But then when it comes to accounts of religious experiences, it's like, well, no, we're not going to accept that. They're just their minds are befuddled by mysticism. They were taking drugs. They were, so they'll kind of make any excuse to not believe the experience, but they, critically they believe everything else. So, and I think that's a huge flaw in the humanities, basically.
Yeah, that's very striking because you put it that way, because you do notice that as soon as it gets into any kind of realm that's not something that we would believe today, it's, oh, we can't do that. They're crazy,
Yeah.
or they're full of it.
I don't want to criticize other scholars too much because research is so compartmentalized, and there's been such a stress on studying one particular civilization or culture and that being your life's work. Stepping outside of being an Egyptologist or a Syriologist or whatever and looking cross-culturally, that's kind of frowned upon. So expecting them to know about near-death experiences and know that, these accounts actually have a human correlation in cross-cultural experience, might be asking too much, especially going back, before the 70s when this became a kind of popularized idea of NDEs.
You mentioned about, I guess, for lack of a better term, baggage that people carry into NDEs. And when I talked to Dr. Grayson and others, like everybody, even Bernardo Kastrup, that discussion was more about psychedelics. But like whenever you go into these realms, you're carrying things with you. Like you're still conscious, and there's something still there about you. And we can get into like ego death stuff, but you're carrying something with you. And so I think you had a story about the Native Americans, about some would come back and say, oh, we have to cooperate with the colonials. And then the other ones would come back and say, no, we have to like defeat them.
Yeah.
And then you have to, like you said, take apart, maybe whoever's recording this part down in history is changing it, how they want to view things or how they think they should talk about it. And they're not even accurately depicting what the person's saying.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Grayson is saying, people can't even put into words what they experience. And then we ask them like, oh, tell me about what happened to you. So there's so many layers that convolute this. But did you ever come across anything or is there a framework where the NDE seemed more pure or without that kind of tainted? I mean, is there anything there where you can pull from where you're like, this seems to be a thread through all these stories, and even to today, contemporary, where it doesn't seem influenced by what culture? Because when I talked to Eben Alexander, he was like, oh, I was introduced to the idea of reincarnation, but I grew up as like a Christian. I never entertained that idea. So like you do hear some things about they get these ideas put into them that they didn't believe before. Did you find any of those threads throughout all this?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of accounts where what is experienced during the NDE actually conflicts with local beliefs, and people are often told, to, like the example you mentioned, to cooperate with the colonialist or to push back against them. There's examples of things like you need to go back and tell the people to stop making offerings to souls of the dead because we don't need them, and all you're doing is wasting your own resources. Which is, basically an instruction to change your entire religious ritual complex, the way you relate to souls of the dead. So that, obviously conflicts with prevailing beliefs. And then there are atheists who have NDEs who think the whole thing is ridiculous, but nevertheless, they're going to meet a being of light and all these other types of experiences. And then they often change their mind and believe that there is an afterlife after all, after having that experience.
And do you find those more compelling personally when you see those that conflict against the local? I imagine it's a little bit, I mean, you have to imagine like all the accounts too that, like we just mentioned, weren't recorded that way because they conflicted with the local beliefs. So they're just like, well, we're not doing that. We're changing that story. So maybe it's even more than the percentage that have that happen.
Yeah, if an account conflicts with a belief, there's a Zuni account, which I think has a being of light, which was not a part of Zuni afterlife beliefs. So things like that, it makes me think that people really are having the same type of experience, and then they're culturally contextualizing it. Well, I don't want to say afterwards. What I would say is, in that same NDE, he saw Kachina gods, which very much are Zuni manifestations of the divine. So I think it's a case of actually experiencing it in real time in an enculturated way. I don't think like we shed our culture just because we've shed our bodies. So it's experiencing it culturally, and then it's adding another layer of cultural elaboration when you have to describe it and kind of give it a coherent storyline, essentially, when you tell it to somebody. And then, like you said, then the researcher or the whoever was there taking down the story adds their own elements to it. I'm doing a project currently on ancient Greek and Roman afterlife NDEs, and it runs the whole gamut. So we've got like the earliest one is the myth of from Plato, which a lot of people know about. And it has all the kind of familiar elements of an NDE. Dies on a battlefield and comes back to life 10 or 12 days later. And so you strip away a lot of the stuff that Plato put in there and it reads like an NDE, but it's pages and pages and pages of Plato kind of, using this account to expound on his philosophical and moral ideas about reincarnation, about the nature of souls of the dead, about the workings of the universe. And then you've got another account that's like maybe 3 or 4 sentences that just describes the fact of somebody having an NDE, being sent back, and waking up. So they have obviously very different purposes. Plato's was to teach his philosophy. The other one was just basically to say, look at these miracles that exist and prove life after death.
Maybe this will jump into more of a personal opinion, but I think it's kind of unavoidable as we kind of navigate through this. When you look at this and you think about people who have NDEs mapping kind of their own belief system onto that as they're experiencing it, and then afterward when they have to talk about it, do you feel like this is more whatever this is presenting to them, that it's the same thing for everybody, and we're just like putting little faces and masks on things as we see it, and that kind of gets into what you think that is? Consciousness, or and I know that gets into kind of speculative, so I don't know. And like you said at the beginning, you're not, you try to stay in factual information of what you can navigate, but obviously I'm sure you've entertained these ideas about like what are people interacting with when they have these NDEs.
Yeah, I almost look at it as like a projection of our own individual and cultural symbolic ways of thinking onto like these objective experiences, which so there's the thematic experiences I mentioned, the being of light, leaving the body, all those kind of things that are culturally interpreted, but it's almost like we can't even experience them in a kind of raw, unmediated state. Like to make them experienceable, we have to project our kind of symbolic images onto them. That's kind of the only way I can think of that this makes sense in the way it happens. Because, I mean, even some of the most basic elements are different cross-culturally. So, for example, returning to the body, that's obviously universal because we wouldn't have any NDE accounts if people didn't return to the body. And people often say they were sent back to the body by some spirit or deity or relative or whoever in the other world. That's practically universal too. But then the reason for being sent back to the body is culturally determined or maybe individually determined. So in the West, it's often like you need to go back and care for your loved one, for your son or your spouse or your ailing parents or whatever it is. Or you need to go back and finish the book you started, or, kind of, it's like some personal thing or family thing that you need to do to accomplish. You have this particular reason for being sent back. But in other cultures, like in India, China, a couple of ancient Greek examples, you're sent back because it's a case of mistaken identity. So the spirits in the other world will say, we got the wrong Gregory Shushan. It's not your time to die. We meant to get the one that lives in upstate New York. So they would send me back to my body and I would wake up, and then this other poor guy who happens to share my name would die permanently. Yeah. So how we navigate that, I mean, it just raises the question of like, if a near-death experience is real, and I think it's real in the sense, at least, that it's an experience that people have, what elements of it are real, So being sent back to the body is the same, but how can the reason for it be so totally different and be culturally determined like that? That's a real puzzle to me.
Yeah, I mean, I have selfish motivations. I think I mentioned to your email that my dad passed away, so it's like I've kind of gone down this road of, I don't want to believe lies either. Like, I was born and raised Catholic, but it's like, I'm still Catholic, practice Catholic, but it's shifted over time. It's hard to accept kind of the black and white nature of things, when you look at these NDE experiences and different things. It's like very like a lot of shifting gray and like interesting lessons that people come back with and different things that maybe run counter to what people believe. But it's like, this is really like, if you can show that people through time have been experiencing this and there's common elements, that really just leaves like there's something either biological that's uniform, like you mentioned, through the brain, if you want to take the materialist view, that's just kind of like everybody who, I guess, dies and is able to come back, like has these chemicals released or whatever the argument is. But when I was talking to Dr. Grayson, he was mentioning like, oh, there could be an evolutionary cause, but I even that's like why? Like what's the survival mechanism or what's the point of, what I mean? Like most people who died way back in the day just died. Like they didn't have, all this medical equipment to even resuscitate people.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Cause like, obviously like me, I'm like, I just really want to know, like what are they experiencing? That's why I find those subjects so fascinating. But do you think you do kind of come against that wall of, is it a biological thing in the brain? Or do you feel like you've seen enough, researched enough and understand enough to where you can go like, at least the odds to me don't fall in that realm or that in favor of that?
The most I would say is that I think there are challenges to current materialist interpretations of NDEs. And those actually are the differences cross-culturally. So to give another example, which is, I think, relevant to that, is you've probably seen in the media recently or last couple of years, they had an EEG reading of a man who was dying, and they were able to record his brain readings during his death, which apparently had not been done before, which surprised me. And they found that at the exact moment of death, there's this burst of electromagnetic energy in the brain. And this was also replicated in rats. Apparently rats have the same phenomena when they're killed in a laboratory experiment, massive bursts of electrical magnetic energy in the brain at death. So scientists then extrapolate from that, that's responsible for the near-death experience. And they will often say specifically the life review. That burst of electromagnetic energy is basically all the barriers in the brain kind of collapsing and flooding consciousness with all of the memories that you've ever had. And that's kind of like the last burst of conscious activity before you die. But the problem with that is that idea of this panoramic life review that we know from NDEs and all the memories happening at once does not exist cross-culturally, basically. I don't think I found any account of what we think of as this kind of typical panoramic life review. There's the idea of evaluation of your earthly life, but it's not in those terms at all. So if the, that burst of electromagnetic energy at death is responsible for the near-death experience, then why are near-death experiences different across cultures, and why don't they have life reviews when that brain activity is supposed to be responsible for life reviews? So I guess there hasn't been a good sound explanation to my way of thinking that explains NDEs in all of their similarity and diversity.
Yeah, because I was looking at the case, I think her name was Pam Reynolds, who was having the aneurysm, and I was sad to see she passed away relatively young, like after that. But that's pretty striking, like, because you talk about just one element of the NDE and all the things that they experience on the spiritual plane. Like people aren't even talking about the out of body portion, to where people are noticing stuff in the room that they shouldn't know. And I know they try to go, they weren't under anesthesia yet, and they might have heard something. And I'm just like, in her case especially, it's like, I know. I feel like it's more plausible to say, like, even if you don't want to believe, because I feel like the typical God image puts people off, like religion, structure, people just hate that so much that they'll go to great lengths to not even acknowledge, like, hey, maybe there's something with consciousness that's just different than we can experience, or quantum physics, maybe there's some things going on that we just don't understand, and perception wise. Do you find any accounts Or is it pretty, like you said, it's kind of breaks down story and symbolism with these old texts? Or have you found anything as compelling as some of the earlier accounts or the recent accounts? Or is it just the recording just not there for that kind of thing?
Yeah, the recording isn't really there. They didn't have, that resuscitation technology. So they didn't have, like nowadays, most NDEs occur like in cardiac wards, things like that. And in, these ancient accounts, they didn't have cardiac wards. And also, we can't even determine the degree to which somebody was dead or what the cultural definition of death was. But, I think by and large, human beings can tell the difference between somebody who's dead and who isn't.
Yeah.
So, but, even as far as like cases like Pam Reynolds or whatever goes, to take the kind of hardcore skeptical stance on that, for me, those cases aren't as compelling as say, for example, the Peak and Darien experiences. Those are kind of odd name given to when somebody's having an NDE and they meet somebody, another soul in the other realm, who they didn't know had died, and then they come back to life only to be told that person actually died while they were having an NDE. Or in some cases, they'll meet somebody else who was having an NDE, and then they'll come back and that meeting was verified. There's an ancient Chinese example of that, which is really interesting. It's like 8th century BCE. And this kind of local provincial ruler is on his deathbed, and he's dying of an illness. He leaves his body and he goes to the other world and meets the Emperor of Heaven and has this like joyful, glorious time. And he comes back to life and he tells what happened there. And it's a kind of very detailed, very enculturated NDE, including things like a bear attacks the Emperor of Heaven and he has to kill the bear. And there's like political predictions made and things like that. And standing next to the Emperor of Heaven, he sees this little boy, and then he's sent back to life. And then years later, he's walking down a street in like some other town, and he sees a man blocking his path as he's walking down the street. And the guy's like making eye contact, like he knows him. And he says, who are you? Do I know you from somewhere? And the guy proceeds to like recount this man's near-death experience in great detail, including like how he killed the bear and all these very specific elements to it. And the guy who had the NDE said, "That's amazing. How did you know that?" And he says, "I was the little boy standing next to the emperor. I had died. I had a near-death experience and I came back to life." And he recognized him all those years later. So
Wow.
that's that not only shows, awareness of near-death experience. It was probably based on a genuine near-death experience. It shows it's an example of a phenomena that people are still reporting today and have been reporting throughout history. And that's a particular evidential feature of NDEs, which, is kind of rare, but there's still plenty of accounts of it. And that concern for presenting the account as something that's evidential and recording it in a way where, at the end of this account, it says, this was witnessed on this particular day by this government official and countersigned by this other government official. So they were really kind of taking as documentary scientific approach to it as possible.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, just for me, in contrast to like Pam Reynolds and these other cases, which I agree are really compelling and really amazing, I can see from the skeptic's point of view, maybe it's a matter of we need to extend our definition of death, and that it's bodily death that's the issue that we don't know enough about, rather than being evidence of survival after death. We don't know the nature of consciousness. We don't know what consciousness is capable of, even if somebody's body temperature is lowered and the blood's drained from their body. We just don't know these things. And so like people like Sam Parnia or Pim van Lommel, they're extending the possibilities of resurrection, basically, of resuscitation in technology. And people can be dead for a lot longer than they ever could in history. So to me, that indicates like, if that's even possible, we don't know what was happening, what people could be perceiving during that time when they appeared to be dead.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know, I think Dr. Grayson has a story like that with the red, I forget what vehicle it was, but the patient had seen his nurse who had died. He didn't know it, but he had an NDE and saw the nurse in the afterlife. And she said, "Oh, say sorry to my parents," or whatever, came back, found out actually she had died in a car wreck.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So yeah, those are pretty remarkable.
Some examples of children who will meet some older person in the other world and then come back and describe them and then see a photo and say, oh yeah, that's him. And it's like a relative they never met before.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And even though it's, anecdotal technically because it can't be replicated, it's still the only explanation is like all these people are colluding in a lie and that people around the world have been colluding in the same lie separately throughout history. So I don't know. It's kind of like.
So you believe there's enough historical evidence to say this isn't like a one-off, this isn't random, this isn't some story people are telling. There's enough consistency and enough stories over time and through civilizations that this has been a common occurrence. And I think you mentioned that you believe is the source, because you always wonder, like, where do these beliefs come from? Where did religion come from? And people go, oh, it's just they saw thunder and a storm and they got scared. And it's like this very simplistic explanation, but you feel like it's from these experiences that spawn religion?
I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say religion itself, but definitely afterlife beliefs. At this point, I think that that's no longer debatable from the research I've done, and not just with the ancient civilizations, but with my book on NDEs and indigenous religions, I found something like 50 or 60 accounts from Native Americans, Polynesians, and a few from sub-Saharan Africa of people actually saying, here's what we believe about the afterlife. And the reason we know about it is because this particular person died in this season 2 years ago and came back and told us what his experiences were. So they actually overtly say they know about the afterlife belief because of NDEs.
Would you go, I know some people have speculated that even like Christianity has roots in like psychedelic experiences. There's a lot of theories like floating around about that stuff. Would you go as far to say that not religion itself, like you mentioned, but our major view of afterlife, even in the Western culture, comes from that?
I tend to think that near-death experiences are more of a compelling explanation than psychedelics would be, because of that consistent 9 elements of NDE phenomenology that happen around the world, and also because of the context. It's the only context is it's like defined by somebody dying and coming back to life. Whereas with psychedelics, I think a lot of times, like in shamanism, cross-culturally, there are attempts to access that same realm that near-death experiencers go to. There's a practice called soul retrieval in different cultures where the shaman will, undertake whatever practices, whether it's drug use or repetitive dancing until they collapse or whatever, to send their soul to the other world in order to rescue the soul of somebody who's in danger of dying. So they'll bring that person back, and that person will have had an NDE, but the shaman did it under this kind of controlled circumstance, basically a kind of afterlife access technology or something. It makes less sense to me that shamanism and psychedelic use shamanism would be responsible for it, because NDEs are spontaneous, and they happen, as we said, to atheists, to anybody who's not expecting them, who's never even heard of them. Whereas shamanic experiences are kind of culturally embedded practice that's developed over periods of time.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the that limit that they come up to when they have the NDEs, and like they can't go past that, because you hear that a lot. Like you mentioned, it's everywhere, and you wonder if that's when you talk about how long does survival last, and if you were to pass that, is that pass of you're not coming back either, in terms of medical interventions, and it's an interesting interplay. But I just can't. I'm just maybe it's wishful thinking, but I just can't understand why. Even if it was a burst of chemicals, why over so many cultures, why over so many civilizations would you have entities talking to me, past loved ones? You could see maybe oh, your people who died, and you're kind of like projecting that because you want to see them or you think they're in their afterlife.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of random entities, experiences. They show them things they wouldn't have known. You know what I mean? It's such a strange interaction there that it's just kind of it's frustrating. I wish there was a clear answer, in terms of this stuff, but if everything's so fuzzy on our physical materialist side in terms of what death means and what happens with the brain, and then what happens over there, it's did you ever come across anybody who was ever past that threshold to get up to that threshold, or was told what's beyond that threshold besides oh, you just can't go back once you pass there?
There's a Vedic Indian account, which is very much a kind of elaborated cultural mythology, but it's about a little boy who goes to the other world. His name's Nachiketas. This is from the Upanishads. And he's basically killed by his father for being a pest, for annoying him too much. He's asking him too many questions, and he says, to hell with you, basically. And so he goes to the other world, and the god of death, Yama, is not there. He's like off somewhere else. And he's left there alone for 3 days. So when Yama comes back, he's so upset by his own lapse in hospitality. He says to this little boy, I'll grant you 3 wishes. And so the little boy, first he asks for his father's kindness, which is, kind of poignant in the circumstances. But then he asks, he wants to know the secrets of a particular ritual that will enable you to access the afterlife. And so Yama is okay with those 2. And then finally he says he wants to know the nature and basically the metaphysical meaning of the afterlife itself, the secrets of the soul and the universe, and its his role in the universe. And at this point, Yama's hesitant and says, I can't tell you that. Ask something else. But eventually he relents. But all he says is basically it's found in the word Om, which is the cosmic sound of the universe. So that's kind of the most we get from from as far as what lies beyond. But then a lot of the texts don't really present it as that there's somewhere else beyond. It's just this is the place that you're going to come when you die, and you have to go back from here. So, so there's not necessarily always a barrier with another realm beyond it. It's just that the barrier is that you can't stay, essentially.
Because you mentioned psychedelics and how those experiences differ. How do they differ in terms of, because a lot of people take ayahuasca or sort of DMT or something else, and they'll go off on this journey, and they come into contact with entities they swear are real. There's been reports of seeing things that other people see. It's pretty compelling, but how does that differ from an NDE? And what would you say is happening there with, if you've done any kind of looking into psychedelics, what do you think? Is it accessing the same thing, or is that more in line with, I think that's just a chemical experience?
I'm not entirely sure about it. I don't know of any good studies of veridical observations during psychedelics, out of body perceptions or anything like that. I don't know if there's anything evidential, essentially, that would back up the claims. So, I mean, I kind of speculate that maybe they're they're compromising the brain in similar ways as the brain is compromised at death, triggering the same types of elements of the brain, and it's kind of triggering this proto-NDE type experience, but it's not a full-blown one.
Is the argument that it's decreasing brain activity, which death decreases brain activity, and maybe you shouldn't have these things, but is that still, I guess, the understanding of psychedelics and what happens? Is it quieting the brain to where it's if it's an antenna and you're tapping into consciousness, then you're kind of seeing behind the curtain, if you will?
Yeah, I don't know if there's neurophysiological evidence for that or not. From my understanding, it's stimulating particular areas of the brain and maybe switching off other ones. But yeah, it's not my area. But there's a scholar, Pascal Michael, who's done some really interesting research in that area. He did a study of people taking DMT and ayahuasca and various kinds of psychedelic substances, and did a direct comparison with near-death experiences. And he found similarities and differences. One of the main differences is this kind of science fictional ideology or manifestations that people with psychedelics have been experiencing. So machine elves have become this trope in psychedelic culture. People see a Borg cube, which is obviously taken from Star Trek. So really, sci-fi type stuff. And those just don't really happen in NDEs practically at all. On lots of encounters with insectoid sort of alien beings, and lots of overlap with UFO culture. And another thing he found was that people who have these experiences, they'll come back totally convinced that it was real, and they'll say, I have no doubt that these insectoid beings were true interdimensional beings, and they could see into my soul and all this kind of stuff. But then as time progressed, a year or two later, they would say, actually, I was just tripping really hard. So they start to doubt it and kind of realize that it actually really was the drug. But with near-death experiences, people have an actual NDE, they pretty much never cease to believe that it was a genuine experience. So that the feeling of it and the conviction.
Interesting.
stays with them throughout their lives. It really changes the kind of whole metaphysical worldview. And I think that's a kind of poignant difference there.
Yeah, because I think some of the arguments are that, the brain releases DMT upon death, and it's kind of stimulates some of these experiences that you have with the NDE. And I guess if you were to compare those two, then I guess that doesn't really map as well as that some people throw out. Then would that be accurate to say based on the NDE experiences and being different? Because you get some people who say that they're very similar, but obviously I don't want to put words in your mouth, but did you disagree with that?
Well, I haven't done DMT, so I couldn't say, and I haven't had an NDE, so I couldn't say. But I've done mushrooms and LSD and things like that in my youth, and there's nothing aside from like that, the feeling of oneness and the feeling of transcendence and of the impression that you're in some other realm. Those maybe map onto a kind of NDE consciousness, which might be similar. I couldn't really say. But I guess, you could make an argument that like these machine elves and insectoid aliens and things like that are the symbolic projection onto the beings of light and the afterlife spirits that these enculturated psychedelic people, psychedelic drug takers are kind of imposing onto these same entities that people having NDEs encounter. But I just think that the descriptions are so different, and the meanings are so different. Like people don't meet these sci-fi type beings and say, I was overwhelmed with an incredible sense of benevolence and acceptance and love and welcoming. And they kind of facilitated my life review. And there was this total lack of judgment and transcendence and oneness. You don't really have that, I don't think, in the psychedelic experiences.
I know there's dark NDEs, which people have kind of like nightmarish experiences, or they're told to like change, or I've heard some, you never know too, if that's some baggage going on, in terms of what they're drawing from. But there's some that are, pretty frightening, but then they said once they accept it, and they kind of move out of that. Did you see those accounts in text too? It's kind of matching what they talk about today in contemporary NDEs?
Yeah, interestingly, there are very few, really hardly any, like distressing NDEs. It might be that there's occasionally a kind of distressing or frightening element. Like, for example, there's a Hawaiian woman named Kalima from 1892 who had an NDE. And it's very, really maps onto contemporary NDEs in a lot of, pretty significant ways. She goes to the other world and she meets deceased relatives and a being of light and, all the rest of it. And she's really happy there and she doesn't want to go back to her body, but a being of light tells her, no, it's not your time to die and you have to go back. And she like refuses and says, I'm not going to go back into that horrible, cold, dead thing. That's not me. I've transcended that. Don't make me go back. And she's like really kind of adamant about it. Until at a certain point, all these spirits who had welcomed her relatives and everyone else, turn on her and they start chasing her and throwing rocks at her and saying like, you need to get back to your body. And they chase her all the way through the afterlife landscape back to her physical body on Earth and force her back into the body. So it was overall like a positive NDE with beings of light and transcendence and deceased relatives had a kind of distressing end because she didn't want to go back.
From a materialist, I guess, traditional explanation that doesn't take into account anything supernatural or spiritual or a higher level of consciousness, what do you think the best explanation is? Because it doesn't seem like if you take any one thing, it really kind of satisfies or checks all the boxes about why people are experiencing what they're experiencing. Like you can say, it's drugs surging through the brain or chemicals surging through the brain at a time of death. But then that doesn't really explain a lot of the other points. It seems like it helps push over one thing, or it could explain one thing, but it doesn't explain something else. Do you think if you take the other side of the argument that what's your best, I guess, explanation to what this could be from a materialist sense?
Yeah, lots of the compromised brain producing all kinds of special effects, essentially. And the brain kind of, because it's a universally biological similar entity around the world, that could explain why NDEs are similar around the world. And then whether it's what we were saying about the projection of these kind of cultural and individual elements onto it, that can work whether it's metaphysical or a materialist explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's I think it would just be, it would have to kind of come down to the special effects of a dying brain with the individual projecting their imagery onto those experiences to make them relatable and understandable and kind of symbolically relevant to their own experience.
Mm-hmm. And then there's Gregory, the researcher, who has looked at all this stuff. What would you say in response to that?
I would say that's one possibility.
Mm-hmm.
It really comes down to like what the universal element is, what's responsible for the NDE. I think the symbolic and cultural projection is pretty solid as an explanation. But whether it's projecting onto special effects of a dying brain or projecting onto a metaphysical reality is kind of the key question. But so I guess if I were taking the metaphysical stance, I would, like I mentioned, question why NDEs aren't the same across cultures. Like why isn't there the life review in different cultures? Why is there different reasons for being sent back? Why is there mistaken identity and all these other kinds of differences across cultures? And also, what is the purpose of it? You mentioned earlier this kind of like idea that this is some kind of evolutionary development. If everything is about survival of the human race, survival of the self, once the brain accepts that it's dying, why kind of create this like metaphysical, wondrous experience that's going to make us think we're not dying? Why do we need a consolation prize at the moment of death to convince us like, oh, it really was worth it? And here's, here, review everything you did, and here's a fake version of your deceased relative and a fake being that's going to radiate love to accept you, to ease your transition. It's like, why would that matter to somebody who's going to die anyway? I guess that's the question. What benefit to the community or to the survival of the species would there be? And I've never seen any good explanation of that. Even the people will say it has an evolutionary function. It doesn't explain why that evolutionary function would exist if you look at it in terms of evolution.
Yeah, because like you said, the whole point is our senses is to survive and to be afraid of something in the dark that we don't know is there. Not to come back and go, hey, you got nothing to worry about. Take as many risks as you want because dying's not so bad,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. There's that too.
Yeah, that perplexes me a lot too. And then like you talked about having confirmed seeing someone there who you didn't know was dead. Like that's bizarre to me. I mean, that really, to me, even if you don't think maybe consciousness or you don't survive, after you cross that threshold, maybe that's it. Maybe you merge back with whatever, prime mover is kind of like underneath all this stuff. And it's just kind of comforting you back into it. Cause, those kind of things just stick out to me. Like we don't quite understand what consciousness is or what happens when you die. That feels like it's more plausible to me, even if you don't take it as far as, oh, there's a heaven and clouds and afterlife. Maybe that's not true. Maybe there is no like one God. Maybe it's just like this life thing, source, whatever you want to call it, like the psychedelic users would call it, like a consciousness that we just tap back into, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you find that? I mean, I know I keep asking you this in different ways, but if you look at the plausible explanations for this stuff, like, do you inch toward one way or another, or just like, we just don't quite understand that aspect of, metaphysics or whatever you want to label it as versus, hey, it's just a dying brain with some weird evolutionary kink?
I don't think there's hard enough evidence on either side. I think there's, compelling reasons like meeting people you didn't know in the other world and the out-of-body perceptions and all that. It's unexplained, I'll put it that way. But so is the near-death experience in general. It's unexplained. And I don't think that science currently has a compelling reason, not only a compelling explanation for the function of it, for the mechanism, for the cross-cultural similarities and differences. So I just see it as like, it's an unresolved question. Now that's partly what makes it kind of perennially interesting. It's like, the identity of Jack the Ripper or something. It's like there's a reason that what UAPs are or whatever it is. The mystery is kind of sustains interest in it in a way. But this is the ultimate one, obviously. This is like the universal one that affects everybody literally in the world.
Yeah, the paranormal stuff is interesting, and that's kind of why I cover it. It's, some of the stuff, like I've talked to Catholic exorcists before, and they say 99.9% of the stuff that comes to them is just, mental illness or people dealing with issues. But there's that small fraction, just very odd, outside what we understand. And that's what they believe is, hauntings or ghosts. But when you look at the UAP stuff and all these kind of weird interactions, I've talked to people who just think that it's all coming from the same thing. And like these things are popping in and out. It gets very bizarre. It's very interesting, like you said, because like the questions are what's fascinating. Like, what is that stuff? Because you can't just label everybody crazy. You're just all crazy throughout history, through all the research you've done, through the experiences people had. You're just all nuts, or you were just imagining it. Like you can't. That to me is very intellectually lazy.
Yeah, especially when it's been happening around the world and throughout history. There are a couple of really interesting anthologies about field anthropologists whose views and lives are changed after experiencing, supernatural things in the field. And the fact that like 2 anthologies could be filled with this, and these are Western trained traditional skeptical anthropologists who are not, religious kooks or psychical researchers or whatever. And they describe seeing things like, there's a famous one by Edith Turner, who was an anthropologist in the kind of 50s, 60s. She was most prominent, I think. And she was in Africa, and she saw like a healing ceremony where there was a sick person kind of laid out on a bench or table. And the healer kind of summoned out this blob of darkness essentially from the body, and she saw like this amorphous kind of strange blob rise from the body and hovering in the air. So things like this that they cross my boggle threshold, as they say. I can't deny that like these are skeptical, critically thinking people reporting this stuff, but at the same time, like I don't know what that is, and I find it really hard to believe. So I think a lot of it is, I talk about in the book and a lot throughout my work, the experiential source hypothesis, which is, essentially that we arrive at our beliefs through our experiences. And I think because I haven't had these experiences, I don't have the beliefs. So I dwell in that, the cloud of unknowing, as they say in Christian mysticism, and have just kind of really gotten to a stage where it's not that I'm not concerned one way or another, but it's like I stay in my lane, and I can I'm going to do my humanities scholarship in the history of religions and ancient cultures in the kind of rigorous, critical way that it needs to be done. And however that can be used in near-death studies is fine. It's kind of up to somebody else to then interpret it, which so far, unfortunately, they really haven't. Nobody really has kind of deeply engaged with my work from near-death studies, which I think is kind of unfortunate.
How come you
all
think?
The theorizing, well, let me just say, all the theorizing has been done from the perspective of the stereotypical Western model. And I think that's too bad. As for how come, I think it's because it doesn't focus precisely on whether there is an afterlife. It's not like seeking to answer that question. It's looking at how people in these ancient civilizations negotiated NDEs and incorporated them into their beliefs, and looking at the same time, looking at the cross-cultural perceptions on whether they were true or not, and the evidence for that. But it's not psychical research, basically, which is what near-death studies kind of is. So I think there's also a maybe, I don't want to say bias, but a perception of the humanities that it's not like real science, and it doesn't need to be engaged with on the same level as real science. So I guess people don't want to put in the work. There are exceptions, Bruce Grayson, Ken Ring, they're kind of, willing and ready to confront those kinds of conundrums in research. But there's still way too much just kind of lazy thinking and proclamations on both sides of the arguments. So you have materialists saying, if near-death experiences were real, we would find them across cultures, which we don't. Which,
you're probably like,
Google is their friend. Yeah. But then we've got people who are on the other side who are saying, near-death experiences are real because they're all the same across cultures. And it's like, no, that's just as wrong. So they occasionally will dip their toe into it and say, they've looked at, the myth of Ur or Greece or whatever, and then they make all these kind of generalizations about one account or two accounts. And they think like they've done their humanities. So, and I guess I compare it to like, they don't understand that there's like a whole complex of theoretical and methodological research, and that like, one of my books takes 3 years to research, a year to write, and a year to come out. So this is not like just stuff that you sit down and write and make up after reading a few texts. So it's like the equivalent of me going in and starting to talk about neurophysiology and compromised brain states. I'm not going to do that. So
now, because I'm always curious about people who are, you're very, very smart. You people do a lot of research, very academically minded, want to look at factual, objective information. But at night, I mean, when you go to sleep at night, I mean, are you asking the questions that I'm asking and like kicking around different theories about what you think is true? And it's just obviously from a public facing standpoint, you don't want to just go out there and be that, armchair, like, oh, well, yeah, Monday morning quarterbacking, like, I think it's this and that, without evidence to back you up because of obviously your reputation, like what you've strived to achieve in terms of providing evidence. Are you in that camp? I mean, do you ask these speculative questions that there really isn't an answer for, or do you have an opinion about those things, you just don't want to kind of like put it out in the public?
No, actually, I think I used to think about it more. I don't think you can go into this kind of work. Anybody who studies NDEs on any level, I think you're obviously going to think about and speculate whether they're real experiences or not. And I think I was maybe more preoccupied with that question when I first started this stuff. But as time has gone by, it's really kind of concerns me less and less, and I think about it less and less.
Why do you think that is?
I guess it's just because I feel like the scientific evidence, the psychical research side of things hasn't really progressed all that much in the last 50 years. I mean, there have been these studies where they've put symbols on top of machinery and cabinets in cardiac wards, hoping that if the soul leaves the body, they will see the symbol and come back and be able to say what it was, and then that would prove that they really left their body. It's been 2 or 3 of those studies, and they didn't get any hits. So I know that, resuscitation technology is advancing. And there was an account in Sam Parnia's AWARE study where he claimed that he was able to pinpoint out-of-body perceptions when this person was, verifiably clinically dead. So, I mean, that's interesting. But I guess I just feel like it's kind of hit a wall, and I'm not sure what more speculation on my part could contribute to that. So again, I just kind of try to stay in my lane and figure out what the civilizations and the cultures themselves said about it, and how that might map onto contemporary ideas of NDEs. But as far as using it as evidence for a metaphysical interpretation of NDEs, I kind of feel like it's above my pay grade, which is already pretty minimal.
Would you say you've kind of given up hope that there will be an answer either way? Like, you're just never going to fully understand consciousness, science, or kind of what's going on there, and that there's not going to be any kind of new research necessarily that's going to prove either way, whether your body's leaving or outside of these anecdotal accounts that are interesting, but yet there's never any repeatable proof.
I mean, I hope there would be. I think there were certain features of those studies that could have been improved upon, and I wish they would have the funding to do it. But I think that's probably the main obstacle is the funding. It's not that they've given up hope. It's just almost like I don't even think of it in those terms anymore. And including like whether there's an afterlife or not. It's not that I don't care one way or another. It's just like I've kind of reached the state of like acceptance one way or another, that I guess I feel like at the time when I die, I'm either going to have this experience that's this amazing kind of glorified supernatural mystical transcendence, and then I'm going to die, and then I'm going to switch off after that experience, at which point I won't care and I won't know because I've just had this, mind-blowing transcendent experience, or I'm going to have that experience and then I'm going to continue on to another state of being. And it's almost like I'll find that out when I get there, but I don't think anybody's going to be able to tell us which of those two options it's going to be before we do get there.
Is there one particular case that you would highlight for the NDE side that is the most compelling to you that you have found through all your research? And then the part two of that would be, because you kind of touched on it briefly, about the kind of just the paranormal in general, and some of these people who are very, they're not in one camp or another, and they're experiencing things that are just so odd and strange. Do you have a story or an anecdote from that you would find the most compelling? So one NDE and then one kind of paranormal oddity.
Again, the Peak and Darien cases are the most persuasive to me.
For those, when you say like the people kind of witnessed another person who had died and didn't know it, for those stories, that's, to me, I would agree, that's kind of like the most interesting part, I think, because it's just, how else would you know that unless there was something else you're tapping into? Again, that doesn't explain what, if you stay in the afterlife and you keep going, you could still end up not existing or whatever, but you are tapping into something for a certain amount of time to give you that information. So how do you map that onto, does that give you that moment of, hey, there's something there? And are those confirmed? You've seen reports that are just like, this definitely happened. They've confirmed that they didn't know that this person was dead, and they went back and they've checked it all out. And is there factual evidence like that?
Yeah, they've claimed that there is. The fact that those accounts occur cross-culturally and around the world. I mentioned the ancient Chinese one, there's an ancient Greek one. I just find that, pretty astonishing, really. You could say, well, people have similar ways of making myths around the world, but that's a pretty specific thing, to have met somebody in the afterlife you didn't know had died during a near-death experience, and then you come back to life and it's confirmed. And again, like I was saying earlier, I was on my soapbox about believing our sources, and scholars who accept the testimony of their sources, except when it comes to accounts of personal experiences. If I kind of put my money where my mouth is in a situation like that, I feel like, I have to respect those accounts because I don't have a legitimate reason not to, other than going in with a kind of judgmental sense of disbelief and essentially coming from the position that I don't believe my source. That person is lying. That person made up that story. It's a cultural story or whatever kind of diminishing response I want to have to it. So in that sense, the cross-cultural stuff, I think, is potentially compelling as far as, these being actual metaphysical experiences.
Do you have a paranormal event that you'd share as being something that's very peculiar? Is it the black blob that came out of that person?
That's an interesting one, but there's also, I think some of Ian Stevenson's work on reincarnation has been really interesting. And there's actually some crossover with my work. In my book, The Next World, I had a chapter on looking at the intermediate states of people, mostly children, who remembered their own reincarnation. Some of them remember having died and basically had a near-death experience before being reborn, but rather than being sent back to their body, they were reborn in a new body. And those accounts read very, very much like a near-death experience. So, for example, there's a little boy in Japan in the 19th century named Katsugoro, and he remembered his previous life in which he died, went to another world. He looked down and he saw his own body. He saw his funeral. Then he met, a kind of being of light who assisted him in choosing his next life. He met deceased relatives, kind of this whole sort of very similar near-death experience complex. And that to me is really fascinating because it's a completely different type of narrative. It's a narrative of reincarnation, of past life memories, but like embedded in that is a near-death experience, except not near-death, it's an actual death experience, which maps on exactly to an NDE. And there's examples of that from all around the world. There's ones from India and Burma and Japan and China, and actually from America as well. So again, it's that cross-cultural consistency that I think is is really interesting. And, just to put it in context with my own work with NDEs, before I started this work, there was like a handful of cross-cultural NDE accounts known. There were like 3 or 4 known from Native American accounts. People were aware of the myth of her. And now, I've brought up like, probably a couple hundred, which would kind of been buried in the literature. So I think, it wasn't that long ago that a lot of skeptics were saying, this is just a New Age Western phenomena. This is just kind of New Agey nonsense, and it's not a real experience. It's just one person repeating what they keep hearing. And I think my work has proven, at least, that that's not the case. And to me, that's kind of essential to either argument. If you're going to make a case that they're metaphysical, they have to be happening to people around the world. And if you're going to make the case that they're materialists, then it's the same thing. So, which is a kind of circular argument going back. But I do think that, going back to the reincarnation thing, it's, there's no evolutionary advantage of that either, of a near-death type narrative being embedded in a past life memory narrative.
And there's no difference there with the reincarnation. That's actually something I want to pursue. I heard that a while ago about the children experiencing that. And is it kind of map onto the NDE kind of similar, or is there any difference? Like I was going to say, it'd be cool if you said, they crossed the threshold and then they were reincarnated. I'm like, well, maybe there's that piece that when the NDEers go through that, but they never pass that either. They get kicked back like you would a normal NDE, but they're back to another life. And is there any objective evidence for that, to where they're recalling things they shouldn't know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. As far as the threshold, I don't think that that doesn't seem to be highlighted as much in those. I think the threshold is that they're in the afterlife and they're not going to stay there. So they're reincarnated instead of being sent back to the body, basically. But up until that point, it is if you took it out of the reincarnation narrative context and you just said, here's an NDE, nobody would doubt that. I certainly wouldn't doubt it, that it was a really valid cross-cultural example of an NDE. They just read exactly like NDEs. But as far as the evidence, work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, especially at University of Virginia. Stevenson wrote multiple volumes of basically investigating these cases where these children would have these memories. They'd start saying, I want to go back and meet my other mom, or say, can we go meet this particular relative? And that relative doesn't actually exist in this person's current life. And they kind of start developing very detailed memories of their previous life, and they're able to, tell their parents or researchers how to get to their previous house. Turn left down this street, turn right there. They were recognized by members of their previous family and accepted into the family. They knew details about, the layout of the house, about where things were, about their previous profession.
Oh man.
Pretty amazing.
That's wild.
Stuff.
Yeah.
And again, it's like either a lot of people are lying and kind of, colluding to create this whole lie, or these experiences are really happening cross-culturally. And again, they're known from all over the world, basically.
That's fascinating. Well, I think that's
I think they're fairly compelling evidence.
Yeah, that sounds like it. I did. Yeah, I remember hearing about that years ago when I first started looking at NDEs. But I'll have to look deeper into that, because that's pretty amazing. And another wrinkle in everything, trying to understand what's going on. I thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. If people want to check your work out, your books, your websites, what's the best places to go to?
I have a website, GregoryShushan.com, just my full name, and I'm on all the social media under my full name too. So pretty easy to find. And the books are all on, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you shop.
Cool. We'll link to all those in the descriptions. And thank you again for coming on. I really did appreciate it. And if you ever come up with anything, new books or information, let me know, and I'll be happy to have you back on.
Great. Thanks a lot. Enjoyed it, Scott.
And don't forget, if you like what we're doing here on the podcast, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe.